Excellencies, distinguished speakers, guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Juki and I'm the Executive Director of CARI ASEAN Research and Advocacy. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome all of you for joining us at this webinar, Greening ASEAN Towards Green Recovery in ASEAN Post-Pandemic, in partnership with ASEAN Business Advisory Council, ASEAN BAC, and ASEAN BAC Malaysia. And today we are indeed very honored to have a lineup of distinguished speakers to enlighten us on ASEAN's effort on how the climate agenda is aligned with the recovery from the pandemic once the third and fourth waves of the pandemic have come under control. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, His Excellency Dato Sri Paduka Dr. Haji Abdul Manaf bin Haji Metussin, Deputy Minister of Finance and Economy of Brunei. Welcome. And next, I would like to also welcome Kun Duangjai Asawachintachit, Secretary General of Thailand's Board of Investment. Welcome to you as well. And Dr. San U, Chair of ASEAN Senior Officials on Environment. Welcome, Dr. San U, as well as Mr. Cedrice Rimaud, Corporate Bonds and Green Finance Specialist from Climate Bond Initiative ASEAN. He'll be joining us later on. Now, we have a very packed program today, but do send in your questions so that we will get to them later on, if you haven't done so upon signing up. Now, I will be making a presentation later on, but first, to introduce our keynote speaker, may I now invite Tan Sri Dr. Munir Majid, our chairman, to take over. Tan Sri.
Thank you very much, Juki. Can I add my words of welcome to everyone, wherever you may be. I think there are a few from Europe, few Australia, New Zealand, but mainly in ASEAN, as it should be. And welcome to this webinar. And first of all, and most of all, I would like to recognize our keynote speaker, as mentioned by Juki, the Honorable Dato Sri Paduka Dr. Haji Abdul Manaf bin Haji Metussin, the Deputy Minister of Finance and Economy for Brunei Darussalam. And I think Brunei is the chair of ASEAN this year, and it is quite clear in terms of its priority economic deliverables, what it wishes to do and how it wishes to push the ASEAN agenda this year. And in that, in those PEDs, priority economic deliverables, sustainability looms large. And I'm sure in his keynote address today, the Honorable Dato Sri Paduka Dr. Haji Abdul Manaf will enlighten us further on how Brunei wishes to push this along. I would like to thank him beforehand for having agreed to speak, and I'd like to say we are all looking forward to his speech and what Brunei proposes to do this year. So, Tuan Haji, can I please welcome you and ask you to make the address. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for inviting me for this afternoon. I think Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good afternoon, Your Excellency, Tan Sri Dr. Munir, Chair of CARI, Honorable Rosalind Meranti Rahman, ABAC Chair for Brunei, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for the invitation and the opportunity to speak at today's event. I think it is still not too late also to wish my fellow Muslim colleagues Eid Mubarak. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has created a global unprecedented shock involving simultaneous disruption in the political, social, economic, and financial structures of the modern world. The ASEAN region is not spared from its effects. It has severely impacted economic activities, disconnected supply chains, limited people's movement, and business closures due to the lockdown and interrupted industrial activities. During this difficult time, ASEAN has shown its solidarity and joined hands to mitigate the impact of the pandemic without losing sight of its integration efforts. We are grateful for the active contribution by the private sector, especially the ASEAN Business Advisory Council and other joint business councils to address the issue at hand. In this regard, we should continue to build on the momentum to accelerate the post-pandemic recovery efforts. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Brunei Darussalam, as the chair of ASEAN for 2021, has the honor to lead the region towards ASEAN's economic recovery. The theme, "We care, we prepare, we prosper," affirms ASEAN collective commitment to care for its people and prepare for future challenges and opportunities with the goal of ensuring that the whole ASEAN community can continue to prosper. Under the ASEAN Economic Community, Brunei Darussalam has identified 13 priority economic deliverables, which are categorized under the 3 strategic thrusts, namely recovery, digitalization, and sustainability. These deliverables demonstrate our efforts towards the region's economic recovery while leveraging on new technologies and digitalization to ensure sustainable economic growth in ASEAN. Brunei Darussalam sees the increasingly urgent need for our region to prioritize sustainable development. Thus, we have identified 4 key priority deliverables under the strategic thrust of sustainability. Firstly, ASEAN framework to support food, agriculture and forestry small producers, cooperatives and MSMEs. Second, ASEAN Joint Declaration on Energy Transition and Energy Security. Third, Framework for Circular Economy. And finally, key recommendation to respond to the opportunities and challenges of a mineral-intensive future. These deliverables are designed to prepare ASEAN in its efforts toward achieving recovery measures that promote greater resilience, inclusiveness, and sustainability. For instance, the development of framework for circular economy will focus on the importance of green growth while taking into account environmental protection, promotion of clean and renewable energy, green technologies, in sustainable consumption and production, among others. Our deliverables are also complementary to the work that is currently being done under the implementation of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, in particular the 5th broad strategy, advancing towards a more sustainable and resilient future. Specifically on implementing action towards climate-aligned agendas. The strategy has underscored the need to manage not only disasters and emergencies in the future, but also mitigate the impact of climate change and implement measures to make use of climate-resilient solutions. In pursuit of the regional economic recovery in a more sustainable manner, it is important for us to also keep in mind that the sustainability agenda is a long-term ambition. This is also in line with our national aspiration prescribed in the Economic Blueprint for Wawasan Brunei 2035. One of the aspirations is sustainable environment, which aims to conserve the environment by ensuring our natural assets and resources are well preserved. One such example is the Heart of Borneo initiative, where Brunei Darussalam and Malaysia, as well as Indonesia, committed to conserve around 220,000 square kilometers of Borneo rainforests. For its part, Brunei Darussalam has pledged 58% of its land area towards this cause. Second, promote economic growth through green growth initiative and sustainable blue economy, where we have committed to protect up to 20% of our total marine area annually. And third, invest and promote sustainable businesses and technology, of which Brunei Darussalam is ranked 46 in the Environmental Performance Index in 2020. Regionally, Brunei Darussalam joins other ASEAN member states in committing our efforts in achieving the right balance for the purpose of economic development while being cognizant of environmental preservation. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, to fully achieve true balance among development and conservation, I believe both policymakers and private sectors need to cooperate through a joint cross-sectoral collaboration and to work collectively to enable systemic change needed by the region for a sustainable and resilient future. I believe that only through strong partnership and management we can progress and recover towards a greener ASEAN. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities of our economies, and it's provided us with a lot of lessons on how to better manage our present and future policies. Undoubtedly, we will face more challenges along the way, but what is important is for us to continue our collective efforts toward improving the lives and livelihoods as well as security of ASEAN future. The webinar series today, organized by CARI, is timely and meaningful as it provides us the opportunity to engage on an important subject matter. Therefore, I look forward to a fruitful and productive discussion ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Excellency Dato Sri Paduka, and for that address, which lays the ground for our discussion today and gives us hints of what Brunei is doing this year within a wider ASEAN context. Indeed, let me actually, of course, it is still Shawwal actually, and so Eid Mubarak is not absolutely in order, but because of this pandemic, every day looks the same. You forget, where you are, what month you're in. But thank you very much indeed. And from what you've said, it is clear that there's a follow through in terms of what Brunei is doing with respect to the three trusts, of which sustainability is one, and the various actual activities that you're undertaking that falls in line, indeed it falls in line with the ASEAN recovery framework, the ASEAN comprehensive recovery framework, which talks in its fifth pillar about a more sustainable and resilient future. And so you also made the point that this is a long-term vision, but I think there'll be some people who'll be perhaps who might be impatient, in terms of how long is a long-term vision, and generally in terms of impatience with respect to the speed, at which ASEAN moves, against very good structured plans. But we will see in the course of discussion what specific countries is doing. In this case, we're looking at Thailand specifically. We're talking to the Secretary General of the Thai Board of Investment, Duangjai, Asawachintachit. And then we're also talking in terms of what ASEAN officials are doing to His Excellency Dr. Sun Oh, who's the chairperson of the ASEAN Senior Officers on the Environment, and finally bringing in the private sector, particularly the kind of investment private sector has to make. We'll be talking to Cedrice Rimaud, who is the Climate Bonds Initiative man that we've invited, who has got extensive fund management experience. Now, I wish to repeat before we start with our discussion with the keynote address that there are two things that we'll do. After my preliminary remarks, I also wish to invite Juki to play a different role from being a master of ceremony here, to actually show what CARI itself, has been doing in respect of the green economy. The 4 policy papers that CARI has done, and she would present them before the panelists do their presentations. But I wish to underline that we must be honestly serious about greening and sustainable development and not just pay lip service to it. See, climate change is a real threat. So developing ways that protect people and the environment is imperative. Now, if there is not this realization, there will not be appropriate policies, corporate responsibility, and people acceptance of new thinking on development that does not destroy the life of the earth. So let's build back better in a real and not rhetorical way. The foundation is to let people see how sustainable development goals are not distant and abstract terms, but have real relevance in their lives. Good health, clean water, efficient and cheap energy, clean energy as well, good transportation, no pollution, a green environment, secure jobs, social support. It's a long list. We need not just to prioritize, but to work through how each in this list is linked to the other. There are some green shoots of recognition. His Excellency has identified what ASEAN plans to do, has been doing, but looking specifically what's taking place. There are some green shoots of recognition on the need for green recovery and development in Southeast Asia region. Now, Singapore, I would contend, leads the way with many sustainable approaches, such as, for example, in very extensive solar projects. Now, Malaysia, through the central bank, has come out with a guidance document preparing the financial sector for climate resilience and enabling an orderly transition to a greener economy. So there are good indicators about. They have to be built upon, and the green objectives have to be fully realized. Now, advanced countries ahead of the curve can, through regional thought intermediaries, indeed, such as CARI, introduce ways and means towards green recovery to those who are below the curve. Now, the best recommendation they could do is to show how these advanced countries have benefited their economies and peoples through green development and mindset. Now, the subject of our seminar today is a post-pandemic. This leads me to one final point in these introductory remarks. Well, people will say post-pandemic. We're still in the midst of it at various stages or types of lockdown. But let it be said, we have to think and talk post-pandemic, even as we are still in it. In this regard, apart from the framework and broad strategies that have been mentioned, what Brunei hopes to achieve this year, as we have heard, now CARI has been working, as I hinted earlier on policy briefs, green policies in regard to the ASEAN economic response in the recovery process. Indeed, as I said, in the midst of it, such as in stimulus spending, tax measures and incentives, future of work, and social justice and equality. So I think with that ending, it comes in quite nicely for me to to invite Joo Kee to present the work that CARI has been doing with respect to the 4 policy papers I mentioned. So Joo Kee, can I invite you to make your presentation? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tan Sri. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge and welcome YB Yanti Rahman, Chair of ASEAN Business Advisory Council 2021, who has just joined us. Welcome to this webinar, and we hope to hear your intervention later on. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to present a snapshot of findings from a series of policy papers my colleagues, Asnita Farmi and Eileen Uy and I have worked on, released early this year, focusing on the climate agenda impacting ASEAN by examining the COVID-19 related measures that were rolled out last year. In 2020 as well, parties to the Paris Agreement that includes all ASEAN member states have committed to submit their plans for more ambitious climate actions to be carried out under the nationally determined contributions NDCs based on a 5-year cycle since the agreement was signed. And in view of their significance, we wanted to understand whether climate-aligned policies have been considered in response to the pandemic, given its unprecedented impact. And the 4 papers, as described by Tan Sri already, cover stimulus spending or measures, national budget and taxation, overseas investments, future of work equality, and social justice. And based on the review, we propose a list of broad-based policy recommendations, and these papers were also reviewed by experts in the region. Now, please take note that the data was collected in 2020 and some observations may have been overtaken by recent events. Our assessment shows green policy measures were not a priority in ASEAN countries' stimulus spending. The economic relief measures have focused on healthcare sector, financial assistance for business, tax deferment and moratorium of loans, cash handouts for citizens, but minimal green policies were found in a few countries' stimulus packages. For example, Singapore and Malaysia had green policies and they're in the area of green infrastructure. Singapore's stimulus package included measures such as coastal and flood protection funds, green town program for public housing and etc. And for Malaysia, the infrastructure projects under its stimulus package, such as upgrading of street lighting to LED bulbs, rooftop solar panels, and etc. Moving on, in fact, according to a report by ING and Yale, except for Malaysia and Singapore, ASEAN countries, in this case, the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia were found to have no green policies by way of comparing green measures as a percentage of total stimulus spending. Next, similarly, in terms of national budget and taxations in ASEAN, there were minimal green policies that were introduced in response to COVID-19 as they were focused on stabilizing the economy. Most of the measures, such as tax deferments, discounts, and rebates, were aimed at allowing businesses to survive the current economic fallout. Now, as ASEAN countries imposed expansionary fiscal policy to drive economic recovery, increased government spending was prevalent in all the stimulus packages. For example, Malaysia tabled its national budget for the year 2020 last year in November. That was the first budget to be aligned with the SDG goals 2030 for Malaysia. Indonesia allocated an average fund for climate activities of $6.3 billion or 3.9% of the national budget per year between 2016 to 2020, but still far from the projected needs of $18 billion per year to achieve Indonesia's emission reduction goals stated in the NDC. Now, Singapore, however, has unveiled an ambitious plan called the Singapore Green Plan, a national movement and whole of society effort to build a sustainable green Singapore for all generations. Let's take a look at what it covers. It has a set of tangible goals targeting transforming parks, buildings, phasing out of diesel cars, common infrastructure for electric vehicles, planting 1 million more trees, reducing waste sent to landfills, and increasing the share of public transport trips. And for business community, Singapore will introduce an enterprise sustainability program to help prepare the private sector. And it also aims to be the leading center for green finance in Asia and globally. And moving on to the area of investment, the pandemic drove the ASEAN FDI down, as we know. According to UNCTAD's report, it shows that FDI inflows into ASEAN declined 31% compared to a decline of 42% globally. Now, despite the drop in FDIs, green investments have picked up in ASEAN, driven by funding from international green funds. Now, however, green policies were also not a priority in ASEAN's investment-related policy responses to COVID-19, with most focusing on instead the following areas, such as investment incentives by investment promotion agency for digitalization, for instance, public health-related investment incentives, support for SMEs, incentives for enhancements of affected industries. Minimal green policies were found among ASEAN countries, such as in Myanmar and Thailand, and I'll leave that to our speakers to elaborate further later on. Now, however, there's one thing to note for Indonesia. In October 2020, Indonesia passed the Omnibus Law, amending 79 existing laws in Indonesia to ease business permits and foreign investment restrictions. However, it also repeals the current regulation requiring the conservation of at least 30% of forest area for each watershed area of an island. Now, activists say that the law is likely to draw investors who have little regard for environmental protection. So that's an area of concern. Now, moving on to another aspect, which is the green jobs. Most short-term stimulus packages in ASEAN have a little focus on climate-aligned green jobs. As we know, unemployment rates have spiked to unprecedented levels. The ADB estimated that 11.6 to 18.4 million jobs have been lost in ASEAN, whereas about 40% of SMEs, especially in manufacturing, reduced their workforce in Indonesia, Lao PDR, the Philippines, and Thailand. Now, in terms of equality, COVID-19 has worsened income equality for AMS with weaker fiscal capacity. More than half of workers in most ASEAN states work in informal sector. 70% of ASEAN households have had their income negatively impacted. And the majority of those in vulnerable employment are youths aged between 15 to 24 years old. And also, on the whole, social protection coverage, which typically excludes the informal sector, comprises a large part of many ASEAN economies. Next, however, despite that, the absence of green measures in stimulus spending and other fiscal measures, a series of announcements by ASEAN countries demonstrated renewed enthusiasm in addressing the climate crisis. For instance, Thailand, we understand that there is a law called Environment and Climate Change Law 2021 is being formulated, and the Thai energy authorities and the Federation of Thai Industries, FTI, also are drafting a Thailand integrated energy blueprint to set up a zero carbon emission goal. Thailand also promotes the BCG strategy, that is the bioeconomy, circular economy, and green economy to underpin the Thailand 4.0 policy. And for Malaysia, the Securities Commission has incorporated the ECG in its updated corporate governance code with an introduction of new best practices that emphasize the need for collective action by boards and senior management. And Central Bank of Malaysia also published Malaysia's National Climate-Focused Sustainability Taxonomy for the financial sector. And Malaysia's electricity utility TNB announced that it would no longer invest in coal-fired power plants. And Indonesia, in the recent Leaders Summit on Climate hosted by President Biden, President Widodo also supported the climate actions, but called on the industrialized countries to set an example before less industrialized ones like Indonesia could follow suit. And in the Philippines, the government announced that it would no longer accept proposals to build new coal power plants in a significant policy shifts towards the deployment of renewable energy. So what are the areas for actions or opportunities to act? I'm just going to go very quickly. For the stimulus spending, here we have listed all the short, medium, and long-term measures. For short-term, governments can consider providing financial assistance for green businesses, green reward for cash payout used at sustainable outlets. In the medium term, upscaling for the renewable energy sector, allocation for sustainable and climate resilient infrastructure. And the long term, funding from the government to bail out any industries and assist state governments should be equipped with a safeguard that ensures that the recipients implement carbon reduction initiatives. And moving on to national budgets and taxation, and this is the part that needs a bit more attention. In the short term, it is, of course, encouraged for ASEAN to include climate-aligned and sustainability measures in future state budgets, and probably also to provide tax relief in the form of tax credits to green businesses. In the medium term, ASEAN member states can study the feasibility of carbon and environmental taxes, which is highly controversial. It's a policy option of taxing carbon and activities harmful to the environment. This should be done by taking into the account of the political economy and impact on vulnerable groups of the population. And also the reform of fossil fuel subsidy schemes, and work towards a common minimum tax standards for the region to increase fiscal space needed for the climate agenda. This is in the form of corporate income taxes, CIT. According to OECD, a global agreed minimum effective corporate tax rate for multinationals could increase government's tax revenues by $100 billion a year, which is equivalent to a 4% increase in global CIT revenues. Now, in the long term, once an ASEAN country has gained public support and implemented relevant programs to offset the possible negative impact on vulnerable groups, the carbon tax can probably and should be implemented. Otherwise, the other proposal is to study the feasibility, a possibility of an ASEAN carbon market. The EU, the example is the EU's ETS, the emission trading system, has often been cited as an example and could be considered as a case study. And next, moving on to the overseas investment, there are 3 listed here. And the first one is there are many, but I can only pick 3. First is to provide incentives and blended financing approaches to attract foreign investments into ASEAN, such as de-risking mechanisms. For example, in addressing the shortfall of funds in ASEAN infrastructure projects, the ADB's ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, ACGF, encourages the private participation into green infrastructure projects and diluting the perceived high risk of such ventures through co-financing with the public financing. It also provides ASEAN member governments with technical assistance and access to over 1 billion in loans from co-financing partners. And second, it's for the aviation sector. Efforts should also be made in diffusing sustainable technologies throughout the industry, and likewise for the tourism industry. Now, opportunities to act for green jobs, there are just 3 that I have picked here. Investment into green infrastructure will drive the growth of green jobs. ASEAN has an opportunity to unlock economic growth by doubling down on green infrastructure as well as addressing basic infrastructure gaps. It can also facilitate the move to green jobs in reskilling programs because skills gaps and shortages are already recognized in this aspect as a major bottleneck in a number of sectors such as renewable energy, renovation of buildings, construction, environment services, and manufacturing. And finally, also to encourage the growth of social enterprises in climate-aligned products and services. And that brings me to my conclusion. There is a window for ASEAN countries to build back its economies safer, better, and greener and towards a low carbon recovery with the right policy tools to advance climate mitigation and adaptation goals. It is also imperative that ASEAN trade policies also adopt a climate-aligned direction. In fact, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, estimates by 2050, the decarbonization of energy system globally will generate a 15% increase in welfare, 1% increase in GDP, and 0.1% increase in employment. Secondly, ASEAN countries have signaled the willingness to seriously address climate change and embrace sustainability. However, ASEAN countries still pursue fossil fuel-related projects and economic activities. There needs to be a strong commitment by policymakers and the private sector to transition to a low-carbon economy. And regionally, although RCEP agreement does not have a specific chapter on environment, member countries can use this opportunity to establish a greener and sustainable supply chain. As RCEP is also projected to boost investment in sustainable post-pandemic recovery, ASEAN should seize this avenue to increase investment in low-carbon initiatives. And finally, as parties to the Paris Agreement, ASEAN member states have obligations to set ambitious targets for their climate actions. More importantly, aggressive reforms, integrated and long-term national and regional development strategies would be needed to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 and for ASEAN's sustainable future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Juki. Thank you very much. Clearly some very good work that has been done, which needs to be drilled down further, and much very interesting and good work indeed. Now, before we proceed any further, let me at this point recognize also the presence of the Honorable Yanti, who is the Chairman of ASEAN Business Advisory Council 2021. Thank you, Yanti, for your presence and support. And we look forward, obviously, to, I'm speaking as the chair of CARI, actually, working with you further in this field. You know. Okay, we will now move on with presentations from our panelists. The game plan is like this. I mean, each panelist will make an initial presentation of 8 minutes, which will take us to about half an hour. And then I will ask them questions to start discussion with them so that there'll be a more rounded discussion with them. And there are questions that have come, which I'm going to put to them. At the same time, I'm sure there are questions that will be coming that will be put to them. Therefore, I would first thank her presence here and look forward to her 8-minute presentation. The Secretary General of the Board of Investment from Thailand, Duangjai Asawachintachit. So, Duangjai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to join this event today. With my 8 minutes, I will try my best. I have a short presentation. I hope that, okay, share screen. I guess that everyone can see the screen. I think everyone agrees that there are ample opportunities in green investments in ASEAN, and these can be keys to post-pandemic recovery. Obviously, after having listened to Chung Hee's report, I can see that there are a lot of things that we need to do together as ASEAN members. Of course, there are many factors that affect or have some effect on the possibilities of having green investment in ASEAN. First of all, I think pressure from trading partners is very important. This is the private sector, of course, would be the behavior would be very much influenced by the requirements of trading partners, of their customers, as we can see in a number of industries, such as in the electronics industry. Many multinational companies have come out and announced that they would become carbon neutral by a certain year, etc. And that certainly has an impact on where they should put their investment, who they would buy products from, etc. So green supply chain has become very more and more crucial in ASEAN, because ASEAN has played a very significant role in this global supply chain in many key industries. And also green and sustainability certification is becoming a requirement, or rather than a luxury. So we see, at least I can see from in Thailand, there has been more awareness among private companies that they should pay more attention to sustainability certification if they would like to stay in key international markets. Another factor I would say would very much, this is a factor that would very much affect the regulatory framework change. That is our obligations under different international agreements, and also SDG determination. And also a lot of companies have come out to announce a carbon neutrality target. Although in most countries in ASEAN, we haven't announced the specific date yet. At least in Thailand, we haven't announced it yet, but we're working on it. But we have seen most developed countries have already announced a carbon neutrality target year. So this also would, with the regulatory framework that would change, that would impact what kind of investments that would take place, and also what kind of behavior we would see in the market. Also, the availability of technologies and innovation now can drive the cost down, make low carbon economy more possible than in the past. And also the capital market opportunities, green finance. I've been talking to some financial organizations such as the IFC, which has quite a number of plans on financing low carbon activities, both in Thailand and in other parts of the world. So these are great opportunities for companies that would like to go into these green investments. And also we have seen more active role of large domestic companies that pay more attention to sustainability. In Thailand, for example, we have seen big conglomerates such as PTT and SCG who are playing leading roles in sustainability. And last but not least, the growing domestic pressure and awareness. I think with the degradation of the environment and the natural resources, we have seen more awareness, particularly among communities, when particularly in in the tourism sector, although you in countries where you receive a lot of foreign tourists, such as Thailand, we see that in certain areas the communities are becoming more active in protecting the environment. I took the liberty of taking some information that I received from the IFC. We can see from this slide that in East Asia and the Pacific, in this study, they cover only 4 countries in this part of the world, but still the investment opportunity is tremendous, $5.1 trillion US, and that could create almost 100 million jobs and could reduce greenhouse gas by almost 2 billion tons. So ample opportunities for all of us. Some opportunities that are quite common in most countries in ASEAN, renewable energy. I think every ASEAN member is paying great attention to renewable energy. Biomass or waste to energy. This is also another one. I would also take Thailand as an example. We have ample, a great amount of biomass available every year. So we need to create more value added out of it. And one way of doing it is to turn it into energy. And retrofit buildings for energy efficiency, that is another opportunity. Green urban transport, this is very obvious because the transport sector is one of the largest greenhouse gas emitter. So I think this sector would get a lot of attention from many ASEAN members. We have seen that quite a number of countries are announcing that they would go for electric vehicles. In Thailand, we set the aim that by 2030, 30% of the cars produced in Thailand would be electric vehicles. The list can go on and on and on. I would like to, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but as we can see that there are ample opportunities in ASEAN. But I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the plan in Thailand, that is the BCG that Chung Hee mentioned earlier, the bio economy, circular economy, and green economy. The BCG has now become in the national agenda because we see that this would be our future. Bioeconomy, I think it is needless to say because Thailand is a key agro producer in this region and also in the world. Circular economy, we have a lot of feedstock, biomass lying around. So, and also the plastic waste, both in this country and also the whole region. Good opportunities for us. And also last but not least, green economy. I think everyone agrees that we need to apply greener technologies, not only in the industries, but also even in agriculture. We need to reduce greenhouse gas in the agricultural sector as well. So this is the BCG is now our national agenda. So every agency has to identify what kind of contribution can they make to achieve the BCG. Since I represent the board of investment, I like to mention a few things that we are doing in order to respond to the BCG concept. We are now incentivizing companies that use renewable energy or produce renewable energy for their internal use. Of course, we are giving good tax incentives to renewable energy producers, but also companies like factories, if they would like to install solar panels on their roofs, they can come back to us and apply for tax incentives. And this measure has been very successful. We have a large number of companies that have gone for this kind of measure and install quite significant renewable energy, particularly solar, whether it be rooftop solars or some companies would go for floating solars, etc. And also we are incentivizing companies that would invest in additional systems to reduce impacts on the environment. And we are now expanding to cover companies that have projects to reduce greenhouse gas, let's say to reduce the carbon emission, etc. And also we are incentivizing companies that if they manage to achieve sustainability standards such as in the paper industry, FSC, or even for some biomass energy. And also another thing that we have been doing is that we are coming out with a longer list of substances that would be prohibited if companies would like to apply for any tax incentives from the BOI. For example, if they are in cold storage industry, they have to use the freezing agents that have low global warming potentials. So we try to use our incentives as a tool to encourage people to go for greener economy and at the same time to reduce or to prohibit the use of substances that could cause global warming. There are some plans to move forward. Of course, the green industry certificates, this is a certificate issued by our Ministry of Industry, and also the renewable energy consumption goal for the future, because the Ministry of Energy is working on work plan to decarbonize the energy sector in Thailand. Plastic waste is very important for Thailand, and there are many proposals, and this is a roadmap on how we should manage the plastic waste. We have large companies like PTT and SCG who has projects to recycle plastics, and they have the technologies to turn it into food grade plastics. I have some examples of some projects, but I think I have used on my 6 or 8 minutes, so I like to stop here, and if I could use some of the remaining slides for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duangjai. I was very taken by one of details of your presentation, which I liked very much, about the prohibition by the BOI of the use of substances, causing global warming. For example, refrigerants, with global warming potential. As a follow-up question to that, has Thailand, I'm not trying to put Thailand on the map, but since you're here, I mean, because many things can be said about Malaysia or Indonesia with its omnibus law and so on and so forth. But since we're talking about Thailand here, has Thailand actually turned away? Have you actually turned away investments which do not fit into your green policies?
What we do is, let's say we have a project. Let's say you have somebody who would like to invest in cold storage, but they intend to use or plan to use freezing agents that happen to have a high global warming potential. What we do is that we would ask them to change the freezing agent if they would like to get approval from us.
Mm-hmm. And they have done so? Have you had experiences of that doing so?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Now something a bigger question. You have a massive Eastern Economic Corridor, development plan, which is one of the understated projects in ASEAN, because it's huge. It's huge, and of course it's meant to attract huge amounts of investment. What is what's the trend of investment that you're getting for the EEC generally, but particularly for the EEC? If you would like to find it.
When the EEC initiative was created, it has always been the location for new industries for Thailand, the so-called S-curve industries. That means industries that use higher technology. That is the intention, and has always been the intention. And the EEC, actually, the eastern coast of Thailand has already been the most important industrial area in the country, because the automotive industry hub is there, the petrochemicals hub is there, and also the electronics industry, and even the food industry. And one example of the green project that we are implementing in the EEC is that since we would have the LNG imported, PTT would be making use of the cold from the LNG when they and then we will be investing in a cold storage that would be using nitrogen as a freezing agent, and as nitrogen is very friendly to the environment, although of course more expensive, and because that would respond to the green initiative in Thailand.
Thank you very much. There'll be a second round of questions later as we move along. We want to move on. Thank you, Duangjai. Thank you very much. Can I now invite Dr. San Oh, who's joining us from Myanmar? He is a chairperson of ASEAN Senior Officers on the Environment. It'd be interesting to see what's happening in this scene, sort of the planning and talking and discussion stage at the ASEAN level. Dr. San Oh, please.
Thank you, Seri. So thank you. So very good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm greatly honored to join this meeting and to have this opportunity of presenting this brief presentation on regional cooperation on green recovery, aspirations and realities. Next slide, please. First, allow me to present the environmental status in the region of ASEAN. So ASEAN is endowed with rich natural resources. So ASEAN has a lot of diverse natural resources presented here. So, but we, at the same time, we are threatened by massive environmental degradation, for example, habitat and species loss, climate change impacts, urbanization, air pollution, population growth, economic development, and gaps in governance. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the ASEAN Vision 2025 on environment. So our cooperation on environment strives to contribute to sustainable development through coordinated efforts, particularly on conservation of sustainable management of biodiversity and natural resources, promotion of environmentally sustainable cities, response to climate change, sustainable consumption and production. Next slide, please. These are the strategic priorities what ASEAN has adopted, namely nature conservation and biodiversity, coastal and marine environment. The series shows that the working groups on these thematic areas. Yeah, so you will see the number of thematic areas, what we have been working on. Next slide, please. I like to share a country principle, particularly my native country, Myanmar, on economic reform. So first, environmental challenges Myanmar has had. It's attracting to a large amount of natural resources for investment in our country. And starting from the last few decades, Myanmar had rising investments and development of the country's natural resources, the energy and power sector, gas, hydropower, mining, agriculture, and forestry sectors. However, increases in economic growth are placing pressure on environment and our natural capital. So we have been striving to combat these challenges. Because these are threatened by the lot of the investments coming in with mixed impacts. So the Myanmar needs actually proper management of natural capital, so which is crucial for economic development sustainability and also for the well-being of our Myanmar citizens. Next, please. This is the diagram of the economic reform, how we intend to overcome. So infrastructure development and the projects which highly rely on natural resources tend to impact the agriculture, fishery, water, forest, extractive industries, and renewable energy. And at the same time, we have heavy industries, for example, in the industrial zones and special economic zones. And increasing investment in industry-based economy. So, I mean, the investments, a lot of investments are coming in, and then they are at the same time threatening our environment. So we tend to overcome these challenges and barriers, and then we'll use the non-renewable energy, and likewise the manufacture for transport for waste and human settlement. So we'll have to combat these challenges. At the same time, climate change is also a very important issue to combat. Next slide, please. So this figure shows how we adopted the integrated approach for the multi-stakeholders engagement. Its vision is to enhance investments in a low-carbon green economy development trajectory that prioritizes the efficient use of natural resources. And this here we'll have the ways to find resilience, low-carbon society, healthy ecosystem and environment, and sustainable development. And at the bottom of the picture, you will see GWC. It means Green Economy Working Committee. So, and any TAXATION means the National Environmental Conservation and Climate Change Committee. So what the state has established for combating climate change and to conserve environment. Next slide, please. We also move towards green economy and like to achieve sustainable development together with our ASEAN member states. So this is a figure what we have developed for the sustainable development framework. So here we'll see the green economy and the three pillars, namely human society, environment, and economy. So low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive as an integrated part of sustainable growth, which promotes general economic growth as of UNEP. So for the sustainable society, we'll have basic needs, education, livelihoods, food, clean water, health, environment, and sustainability, biodiversity, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. What we have we have to have so to solve these issues. Next slide, please. These are the ASEAN greening projects under ASEAN Working Group on Climate Change, which is one of the working group under the ASOEN. So, for example, we have some ongoing projects, namely development of the report on the state of climate change in our ASEAN. And we'll have ASEAN joint statement on climate change, which will be presented to COP26, as you might have known. And development and implementation of facility, company level monitoring, reporting and verification, MRV systems for GHG emissions in our member states. So in order to strengthen transparency for co-innovation, so with the support of Japan ASEAN Integrated Fund, which is abbreviated as BASTI-JAV. Again, we have another one is ASEAN Republic of Korea Carbon Dialogue. And again, next one is Regional Dialogue on Carbon Pricing and REDICAP, which is called as, and ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program, LCEP. Next slide, please. So the projects below are under discussion. So which are ASEAN German Climate Program, ASEAN Climate Action Readiness Program, and ASEAN CIACA 2.0. So these are a series of climate change, ASEAN climate change projects. So now I will present the importance of regional cooperation, especially ASEAN. So we are a ASEAN community. So ASEAN cooperation plays a crucial role towards green recovery. So I believe that this also goes to the question number one, which is assigned to me among two questions. So Secretariat supports, coordinates, and facilitates smooth communication among our EMS. So it organizes events, sharing technologies, experiences, lessons learned. So it plays a great role among our ASEAN nations. And it engages also technical and financial support of donor agencies for diverse themes, for example, climate change, sustainable consumption and production, and etc. So the whole community is thriving to our best and on carbon border adjustments from every possible corner. So, for example, I will give the examples is policies, yeah, and strategies. So it's a very good cooperation. So, and by the way, let me show you what Myanmar has been doing for the climate change. Sorry, I think you might be able to read or not. This is the Myanmar climate change policy, what Myanmar has adopted last 2 years ago. And this is the strategy. So also 2018 to 2030. So this is a Myanmar climate change strategy together with the climate change policy last 2 years ago. And last but not the least, Myanmar climate change master plan. So also 2018 until 2030, what Myanmar has adopted. Next slide, please. So ASEAN has strong aspirations for green recovery with a clear focus on climate aligned agenda. So like Myanmar, I believe all ASEAN member countries has a very good and proper strategies, policies, and plans to combat climate change issue. So I would say my last but not the least, my quote, unity is strength. And I firmly believe that our ASEAN region, our ASEAN member states can cope well with its green recovery soon. So with that, may I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Oh, thank you very much. Very informative. You spent a bit of time talking about Myanmar's national plans. We wish you the very best, you know, and that your political circumstances will stabilize and allow you to carry out your national plans. Now, insofar as the ASEAN region is concerned, I would like to ask you 3 questions.
Yes, please.
Three questions. One is very specific, which I'll ask last. But the other 2 relates to, in your presentation, one doesn't get an idea about how the work of your committee, you know, your environment committee, dovetails into Brunei's sort of, what shall we call it, Brunei's thrust with respect to sustainability. So how is that being driven together? Brunei, what Brunei is saying, all the things that's going to happen, and what you do as a committee to make it happen. That's one question of a broader nature. The second question relates really, you know, to the fact that you mentioned the ASEAN Working Group on Climate Change and other things that you've been doing, but I hear no mention of private sector participation in the work of your committee and working groups and so on. You mentioned projects, of course, with Germany and so on and so forth, but in terms of the regional private sector, the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, in terms of the, you know, of the joint business councils, what kind of you know, involvement have they had in your work? I'll wait for the last question. I'll wait until you've answered these 2.
Oh,
please.
Thank you. So first, working committee or the central committee. So what I've included in one of my slides, and the first one is GEWC, is a Green Economy Working Committee. So it's under the supervision of National Environmental Conservation and Climate Change Committee. It's a state-level committee who established in the last administration, but it is still live. So of course, it's related to the conservation of environment and climate change. So I also believe that it was, unfortunately, I cannot give you the detail here on account of time constraint, but I believe that we have studied a lot of climate action plans and also the imperatives and also the strategies throughout the region. So I believe that our imperative and ambitions of the Environmental Conservation and Climate Change Committee will cover the aspirations of the Brunei plan. So that's the answer of first question. The second is of course, yeah, I also had a very limited time to prepare these slides, so I got to have the chance to include the role of the private sectors. So of course, in the case of Myanmar, so we intend to include the private sector, and you will see the private sector in one of my slides with a figure in my presentation. So the private sector, academia, NGOs, CSOs, and also the research institutions, and then also parliamentaries. So here we included the private sector importantly, so to conserve environment as well as to combat climate change. So also in the series of projects on climate change in the ASEAN region, so I just mentioned the titles of the projects. Of course, and to implement the projects individually, Myanmar, as in my case of Myanmar, so we always include the private sector, NGOs, CSOs, and all the private sector to implement these projects successfully.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I do hope that this collaboration, between the public and private sector, which the Deputy Minister in his keynote address underlined,
yes,
will always be borne in mind as we go through the project. Now to my specific question number 3.
Yeah, yes, please.
This is we are approaching the month of June now, right? And usually in the month of August, and you had mentioned something in your presentation which I picked up, the haze, the transboundary haze. Okay, this has been going on for over 1 generation. Okay, here we are talking about greening ASEAN and so on and so forth. For 1 generation plus, we've not been able to control this blight, this suffocating sort of haze is the wrong word for it, but never mind, call it haze. That's really hitting us year in, year out. What are you doing about it to anticipate this coming August? And what can be done to make sure it doesn't happen yet again?
Oh, thank you. It's a good question. So yes, I already know that the haze, transboundary haze pollution is a very important issue among our ASEAN neighboring countries, including Myanmar. So yeah, so to respond to your question succinctly, so Myanmar is trying its best to organize the related ministries to combat this issue. For example, our department, our ministry, MONREC, Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation, organizes meetings to talk about and to discuss and to find means to combat this transboundary haze pollution, particularly in the border areas with Thailand, China, and now of course Laos as well, even though it's a very short distance. But we have established monitoring stations to measure the air quality in the triangle border. And they are reporting us the monthly measurements to our headquarters, and also the remaining ministries, for example, Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Irrigation, and Ministry of let's say other related veterinary. So we organize the annual meeting, and if needed, twice or thrice. Yeah. So and then we discuss how to find how to solve this problem. And again, the awareness campaigns. So for example, the farmers particularly in the farmers in the remote areas, we educate them so not to put fire after the before and after their cultivation. So it is going steadily, slowly and steadily, but we have been achieving progress to some extent. So it's a way, and then another is the technology, and also including equipment, and also the how to say, our solidarity. So it's a very important issue. I know. So Myanmar is to wrap up, Myanmar is trying its best to combat this transport heat pollution. Thank you.
Well, just maybe we'll move on, but please don't forget the suffocating smog that affects, Malaysia, that affects Brunei, that affects Indonesia itself, and also Singapore, year in, year out, your work. Please, thank you very much. Now we'll move on, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Dr. we move on, ladies and gentlemen, by inviting Cedrice Rimaud, who is from Climate Bonds Initiative, a man with extensive fund management experience. Finance is always the heart of the issue. Lack of it has been a huge problem. Maybe Cedric can relate to us, what has been happening insofar as the financing, in particular, of course, the bonds markets being concerned with respect to greening ASEAN recovery. So Cedric, may I invite you to make your presentation, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. So clearly, Southeast Asia is under a lot of pressure coming from climate change. If you look at the global map of risk coming from climate change, the region is actually extremely exposed to the changing climate. It's exposed to rising sea level, it's exposed to rising heat that can affect harvests, it's exposed to unusual weather patterns like high winds, and it's also exposed from the water scarcity that can affect our populations, our industries. Now, this, unfortunately, climate change is not going to be reversed overnight. The next 10 years are actually critical for changing the direction of travel. And when we see all the amounts of capital that is injected by governments in response to COVID, it's very important that this capital is invested properly to take account of those shifting risks that are happening very much here in the region. Now, the good news is that there is ample capital to be invested into projects that will have the effect of creating some climate resilience against those changes. Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, when all the nations agreed that we should limit global warming against pre-industrial levels, and that we should use financial flows to redirect capital towards projects that are indeed aligned with this objective, we have seen the explosive growth of thematic finance as a way to redirect this capital. In the world today, you have about $130 trillion of bonds outstanding, for example. Now, the size of the green bond market is already $1 trillion as of the end of 2020, and it continues to rise very quickly. If you add to that the social and sustainability bonds that have been issued, you reach $1.7 trillion as of end of 2020. And in this year, again, we see a large amount of issuers coming to market to raise financing with a clear use of proceeds and some clear objectives to combat climate change, and also to add to that the social angle of this response. So that's very encouraging. And for the region here in Southeast Asia and ASEAN in particular, it's a real opportunity to attract new sources of capital towards specific projects. We have seen some issuance already in the major markets of ASEAN. Clearly, the markets that are more developed are seeing more activity, like in Singapore, for example, in Thailand, in Philippines, in Indonesia. So to date, as of the end of 2020, the amount of bonds that have been issued for green, social, and sustainability purposes amounted to $29 billion, and it keeps on rising. So this is the good news. We have seen some examples of projects that are able to attract a large demand from investors. For example, the BTS group in Bangkok has been able to raise a green bond that has attracted demand from investors that exceeded multiple times the amount of bonds that was offered. We've seen in the Philippines, the Bank of the Philippines Island go to the Swiss franc market and raise some financing at a 0% interest rate, which is quite interesting, because the reality of it is that investors in the developed world have investments that are yielding negative rates of return, and they need to invest the capital. So clearly they want to turn to developing markets like in the ASEAN region to get a positive rates of return, and that's what the region can offer with the the amount of projects and infrastructure that needs to be built. If we look at the issuance in the region, actually 73% of that issuance comes from corporations. It's not coming from governments or state-owned enterprises or financial institutions, although they do participate as well. It's mostly by companies that are clearly seeing this opportunity to raise capital to invest in projects. Actually, the response from government has been a little bit disappointing, with Republic of Indonesia issuing several green sukuk, which has been a very good success. Thailand issuing one sustainability bond as well to finance the BTS development as well. Malaysia this year also that can come to market. But this is relatively small in comparison to what we are seeing, for example, in Europe, where France, Germany, and the Netherlands and others have issued very large amount of capital to finance the transformation of their economy. So, and financial institutions themselves could do more. They could issue green or social or sustainability bonds, and then access new sources of capital, and then on lend to small projects that comply with the said framework that they have put in place. Actually, the good news is that the regulatory backdrop already exists. You have the International Capital Markets Association that has published the Green Bond Principle, the Social Bond Principles. ASEAN has taken on those principles as well and has issued its own. There is a taxonomy that is currently being developed by ASEAN to further specify what types of projects would represent green investments aligned with the Paris Agreement. So this is happening. This is good news. And hopefully over time, and in the next 10 years, as I say, which are critical to reverse what we are currently seeing in terms of the impact of climate change, there will be an opportunity to attract new investments from overseas and investors, and not necessarily create new risk. Very often I sense that creating debt that is dependent on overseas investors is a risk. But at the same time, this is for very clearly specified projects, which for most of them have a very clear economic return. So these are good quality investments that are building the resilience of the economies for the future. And they should not be limited to only a few sectors. Unfortunately, currently, we see mostly the investments going to renewable energy and green buildings. But there are many other sectors that could benefit, like sustainable agriculture. For example, Climate Bond Initiative has issued a criteria for agriculture to identify what types of investments would be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Or also water. Water is very important to protect our economies. For example, in the chips industry right now, the fact that Taiwan is under severe water stress is causing a lot of hardship in the whole manufacturing process, because water is used in a lot of different manufacturing activities. This is critical to build the resilience of the economy for the long run. So the capital is here. It's looking to invest with positive rates of return, and bonds, green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds, as well as loans, are clearly instruments that can help provide the capital that is needed to create resilience, to create jobs as well, because a lot of those sectors are very intensive in terms of creating new technologies like renewable energy, for example, and creating some savings as well. Renewable energy is a much cheaper source of energy than fossil fuels. So that's an opportunity. The same goes with green buildings, which will achieve economies in terms of being less demanding from the energy or from the water that they use, etc. So this will demand new skills, new jobs, new technologies, and this is clearly an opportunity for ASEAN, which is very much integrated in the global economy, as Duangjai was saying about the integration with the Thai economy, with, for example, automotive manufacturing or other types of economies. So this will feed through as customers are demanding more scrutiny on the use of all the elements that go into the manufacturing process, how the water, the energy is considered in that manufacturing process.
Thank you very much, Cedric, for sharing with us your knowledge and your experience. Perhaps you could share a bit more, if I could. You're one of the few private sector people, and I was going to ask you a question which I shan't anymore, because you seem to be quite happy with government policies and regulations with respect to the issuance of climate bonds. You don't have any particular problem, with policies and regulations. What in fact you are saying is that, on the contrary, what you find lacking is the actual pipeline of the issuance of bonds by governments. Now, how do you improve this? How do you improve this pipeline of supply, of bonds? Now, on the demand side, who typically are investors in these bonds? Because many of these projects are, again, typically very sort of long-term projects, and insurance companies and so on are the type of people who would invest in this sort of things, or the Japanese post office, and institutions like that. But you seem to be quite sanguine about the fact that there is that demand. Who typically are these guys?
Now, the interesting thing about bonds is that it's an instrument that is well understood by a very large variety of investors. It is an instrument that has been used for decades to put to work all the capital that we put aside, for example, to prepare for our pensions, or to offset the liabilities that the insurance industry is accumulating through the writing of policies. So this is a very large market. As I said, the total size of the bond market is 130+ trillion US dollars. It's massive. It's multiple times the size of equity markets. Now, in that community, there are lots of different investors. So there are pension fund managers, there are asset managers of mutual funds, there are banks that are investing their bank's capital. There are private banks, there are high net worth individuals, there are hedge funds, there are governments as well for their reserves. There are insurance companies that need to offset their liabilities, and so on. Now, each of those investors have different requirements. Some are very risk averse, very conservative, and they need high quality bonds, which governments are typically issuing. A government issuance is usually the highest quality of bonds in a market. But some investors are actually also looking for yield, and you can have the issuance of riskier bonds, which will be attractive to some of the investors who are trying to increase the return on their investments. And also the currency aspect is quite important. You can issue a bond in multiple currencies. For example, like I said, BPI in the Philippines has issued in Swiss franc at the same time as issuing a tranche in US dollars. They can also issue in Philippine peso at the same time. So bonds are quite versatile, and they can adapt to different types of investors.
The interesting thing, is Cedric, that there seems to be an explosion. You said the bond market is huge, compared to the equity market, stock market. But even in the stock market, there is an explosion in terms of the pricing, of so-called green companies or green, projects. I mean, like Tesla has gone up, so many times since it came into the market in 2019. It's 9 times, which is huge, increase. And any green index set against S&P 500, that's better. This helps you in selling the bonds as well, because the bonds will reflect on what's happening with green bonds. But at the same time, and you say, coming back to the question of who on the demand side, guys who want, there is some allegation, right, that whilst the so-called ESG fund management size has increased, from 1/10 to 1/4 of total fund management size, that they're not, the so-called defined ESG funds are not exactly ESG funds. I mean, there's allegation of what they call greenwashing. There are investments which are made actually in non-green investments. How do you sort of answer those sort of allegations, i.e. a misrepresentation, of where the monies go to, or misdescription of it? And how could this be addressed so that people are more convinced, that these monies actually go into green projects?
So you raise a very important point, because investors, obviously will be attracted to investment opportunities where they trust that the end goal is accurate, is aligned with the objective of the Paris Agreement. So, for example, at the Climate Bonds Initiative, we have developed the Climate Bond Standard with a taxonomy that comes with it. And for each sector of the economy, we have indicated very clear science-based arguments about what types of investments would qualify and which ones would not. So there is a very clear indication through that work to avoid greenwashing. And we actually deliver certification on some green bonds that match this taxonomy. The EU is developing its own taxonomy as well to comply also with these requirements. ASEAN itself is in the process of creating a taxonomy also under the ACMF. And that's what is needed to ensure that investors keep trust in this market. And you're right, there is a risk that some of these ESG investments are not, doing enough in terms of compliance. However, I would stress the fact that these instruments are what we call use of proceeds instruments. That means that they clearly specify what type of investments they are directed at. So for the investors, it's actually easy to understand where the money is going. The funds will be segregated for only those types of projects. So there is additional disclosure that comes with this thematic finance, and that's a good thing to establish trust in this market and to avoid greenwashing.
It's interesting. I mean, I want to bring the other panelists in, but one more question for you, Cedric, which is a question that's come from the floor as well earlier. How ready do you think the private finance institutions are to play their important role? You mentioned this already in accelerating green recovery in ASEAN. How ready are they?
I think they are ready when I see them explaining how their framework is built and how they have already done for a few of them some green issuance or social issuance. However, I think they are not ambitious enough. They should push harder because these sectors are actually very, very attractive investment opportunities. Like you said, the Tesla stock price has gone, multiple times up. And there are many sectors that are linked with greening our economies that are very good long-term investments. Creating, an electric railway line in a capital city like Bangkok is a very sound and good and climate resilience investment for the benefit of the Thai people, because it will accelerate the economic growth by allowing people to move freely inside the city and not be, in their car in traffic jams, for example. But there are many other examples. Renewable energy itself is a very cheap source of energy that will compete, head on with all the fossil fuel energy. Sustainable agriculture is a very sound investment because it protects the fertility of the soil, which is essentially, the wealth of the farmer to have soils that are able to continue producing crops. So the idea is that we have moved away from investments that must be done to fight climate change to investment that make economic sense for the long term because they will produce economic benefits.
Yes, thank you, thank you. I like to bring in Duangjai. I think there seems to be a sense and a feeling among the audience, for example, that all these presentations, are all very so well structured and policies so well stated, intentions, targets, so well expressed. But can you give some examples of specific policies implemented in reference to greening policies, to greening projects? Can you actually give specific examples? I mean, there is one comment coming in the Q&A box about is hydrogen, for example, has hydrogen been identified as a green energy? There's a lot of that kind of a development of hydrogen to power sort of power production for power generation. Use of hydrogen in Sweden, northern Sweden, Norway, and so on. Is there any specific? What are we going hydrogen way as well? So two things, specific projects that evidence your commitment to green recovery or green sustainable development, and then a specific hydrogen-driven objective.
Okay, I think if we are looking for some examples of specific policies towards the green economy, the renewable energy is an obvious one. I believe that virtually every ASEAN member has some kind of target for renewable energy. Thailand has one as well. Actually, we have had this target for many years now, more than a decade. And we have this, the Renewable Energy Development Plan that is being revised every couple of years. So everyone is setting a target that they would achieve a certain percentage of energy production that the renewable energy would form, like in case of Thailand, at least 25% of the total by a certain year, etc. But talking about energy, whether hydrogen is one of them, I think it depends very much on the availability of technology. It is still too expensive for most of us in ASEAN, but I don't think that any country excludes this possibility. We often talk about battery EV, and now we use the term ZEV because you never know what kind of energy we'll be using in the future. I think we're looking for a cost-effective solution to the green economy. You can have all the cleanest technology, but whether it is cost-effective or affordable, that's another matter.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there was a question that seems to have gone off the Q&A section is supposed to be 3, but now it's only 2. But this, I think this question is for Cedric, you know, in respect to an ASEAN-wide green bond of some sort. Is there any possibility of doing this?
Well, I mean, you mean the same way we've seen the EU do an ASEAN, a EU response to COVID. I think ASEAN is not as integrated as the EU is. So from that point of view, I don't know if that would actually work. But what can be done is, first of all, to support individual countries in doing their own issuance, sovereign issuance in response to COVID and make it a green response. That's definitely possible. Republic of Indonesia is essentially doing that through their green sukuk that they are issuing in the market and receiving very strong response from investors. And also the importance of development financial institutions like the ADB or IFC and AIIB is critical as well, because you know, they have a role in the market to support governments in the region to successfully access capital. And they have a lot of expertise, and they have a lot of technical assistance program that can help the different stakeholders. And having a preferential creditor status in the market, they can also support the bond issuance by you know, lending their credit rating or guaranteeing some issuance, or even buying some of the bonds themselves. We've seen in some instances where the issuance has been taken on by such institutions. So I'm not sure. I mean, we can always think about an ASEAN issuance, but at the same time, you know, we can do the same by each individual government issuing its own securities.
Thank you, Cedric. I think, Juki, I might have to bring you in on this one, you know, and then take it up together also with Dr. O, you know, in terms of carbon border adjustments. Is there any policy, any plan at these ASEAN level, at the secretariat level that you know of when you are undertaking that study that you presented earlier?
Thank you, Tan Sri. Not really. So I just heard from Dr. San U. Perhaps Dr. San U can elaborate more.
Okay. Dr. O?
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. My presentation, the word carbon border adjustments. Just pick from the question. So honestly, yeah. So carbon border adjustment. But what as a ASEAN, including Myanmar, was working on is the carbon pricing, low carbon society carbon pricing. But just the carbon border. What one understand here probably is the how we can reduce the carbon emission, or how we can how to say pay for the carbon, so and emitted from the industries like that.
If I can maybe say something on this. Singapore is in the process of creating a market with some very credible stakeholders, where carbon pricing would have actually a clearing price for the region, and I think you know, even beyond. That would be very beneficial for the region, because there is a lot of projects that potentially could benefit from the emergence of carbon markets. You take, for example, forestry. You mentioned the problem of haze. You know, deforestation is clearly you know, the reason why we have haze as well. So by introducing a price to carbon and creating positive economic value to the price of the forest, and giving incentives to farmers to protect actually the forests, while the polluting industry can, you know, pay for that price through carbon credits, that will be a very good mechanism to allow this transformation and to protect the natural resources in the region. So that's actually going to happen this year already in Singapore with this trading place where carbon will be given a price. That's a very good, very positive and developments that I think will help accelerate the market.
In fact, there is, just to follow up on that, to all the panelists, a question, from the presentations, it makes sense to invest in green projects, clear economic sustainability benefits, private sectors on board. Perhaps they just need to be pushed more actively because this is new. How about other big projects, activities under governments that are related to environmental protection, biodiversity, conservation, climate change responses, whose benefits are not that apparent or profitable to individual consumers? What could be the incentives or selling points to undertake them? I mean, this might, I think, Cedric, you might be best placed to answer this if not. Can you?
Well, I think there are two different categories of projects. There are the projects that produce an economic return and can be financed through a direct bond issuance where the cash flows of that project will be used to repay the debt. That's what we are seeing. That's corporations issuing bonds and paying back the debt to investors. And then there are the projects that don't have an immediate cash flow production. Like, for example, biodiversity is a case in point, for example, or the protection of a coastline, for example. And this is where the role of government is critical because it's through the government issuance that these projects will be born and will be possible. And the governments should already create frameworks that will protect the environment for the benefit of the region. That's what we should see happening. And for example, the Netherlands has issued very large amounts of green bonds to protect their land, which is under threat of rising sea levels. The same thing will happen over time in Southeast Asia because those risks are coming.
Any comment from Duangjai or Dr. Sano on this question? Okay, that's no comment. There was a question also about how does one ensure that the FTAs contain within the terms green and sustainable provisions so as to sort of impose a kind of discipline on the members of the agreement to adhere to standards, to sustainable standards, sustainability standards. So this was a question, from a policymaker actually, about how you can do it in FTAs. I mean, do you have any ideas, Dr. Sano or Duangjai, before I come to Cedric as well?
If I can make a quick comment, I think sustainability is something that has to be agreed upon. I'm not quite sure whether an FTA can be used as a tool for a country to achieve sustainability. Will it make the agreement even more difficult to be agreed upon? But I think, given the situation, particularly after the COVID-19 situation, every country agrees that we must do something. And you mentioned earlier about different projects that create economic returns. For the public, I think it is very important to involve individuals as well. In Thailand, we hope that we have some good examples, and we hope we can expand the scope, like waste management in communities, local communities. People often feel that it's a burden for them. Actually, it could be a way of getting economic returns as well, because they could generate more income if you develop some kind of business model that makes it work. We have some examples by using digital technologies, by creating some business model that people who collect garbage and segregate garbage they could get some income, additional income. And this could be important for people who earn very little money, but they can manage to get more income from doing something that is good to the environment as well. So it's a win-win situation.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Sano?
Thank you. So since I'm not an expert on trade, but I'll try to speak out as much as I can. Actually, free trade area, so first of all, what the ASEAN has also intended to develop, but I think it's as Ms. Duangjai mentioned, it will be still a bit far for for implementation, because ASEAN needs to talk too much on that area. But anyway, I believe that it's a good principle to develop it. So, in order to reduce the cost expenses, and which at the same time tends to reduce the carbon footprint as much as I understand. So thank you.
Okay, any comments, Cedric?
Well, I'm not an expert on international agreements, but what I can say is that finance knows no borders. And if you are a global bank and you have decided that coal will not be financed anymore, this applies across the board. And that's what we are seeing. More and more banks are moving to exclude the most polluting sectors. And it's only a matter of time until those sectors, cannot be financed anymore. And that's the power of finance. And that's why, we believe so much in the growth of the green bond markets, because finance is going to be the game changer to redirect the flow of capital to appropriate uses. And this can move fairly fast, because after coal comes gas and then oil and so on. And that's the effect that this will have. So FTAs are at intergovernmental negotiation level. What I'm talking about is between banks and their customers, which is the world over. And as we can see, the EU taxonomy is taking some very concrete steps in defining what types of projects would comply with the taxonomy. This is going to drive a lot of international corporations in their choice of investments, of financing, and so on. And this will have repercussions in the region as well. I mean, we see in Singapore, banks are already announcing plans to reduce their commitments to polluting industries. So this is happening.
Thank you very much. I think we just have about 5 minutes left. I would like to give each panelist maybe 1 or 2 minutes, to make some parting remarks, from the discussion that we've had. And perhaps I'll start in the way that we started the panel with Duangjai. Do you wish to say anything in 1-2 minutes?
Okay, I would need only maybe half a minute. I think there are a lot of tremendous opportunities in ASEAN to make ASEAN greener and also achieve economic growth. And this is probably the only way for us to recover post-pandemic. It is a necessity, not a luxury. The greener world is compulsory.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sano.
Yes, thank you. Let me say that I'm very happy to join this meeting and this panel session. And it's a good opportunity for me to learn and observe a lot of things that I haven't known. So it's good for me as well as for the other participants, I think. And I believe that from such kind of events people will be able to learn and receive innovations and from for their aspirations for the green recovery. So after COVID-19 or post-pandemic, so I think it's very beneficial for all of us. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Cedric. Some parting shot.
Well, I think the COVID-19 crisis has been an opportunity to consider a reset of our economies, and all the support that is being provided in response to this crisis is an opportunity to do things differently. And this brings a lot of opportunities. It brings new jobs. It brings new technologies. It advances the field of research as well. And ASEAN should embrace it. And the governments and the regulators, the central banks seem to be, in agreement with that, because a lot of things are being developed in terms of regulations and frameworks that are conducive to this transformation. So, but we shouldn't, take our eyes off the objective. It's a hard change. It's a change that we must do quickly, and but we should be comfortable that we can manage it. We have the means to do it.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to express CARI's deep gratitude to the panelists, and of course, before the panelists, to the Deputy Minister for his keynote address. And from the discussion that we've had, we've all learned quite a bit. At the same time, the tone of it is that people want to see specifics happen. People want to see, things happen on the ground. Let me say, we at CARI, for example, are very interested in seeing things happen, how we can be the curator, of making things happen. And I think there are lots of plans, very good frameworks, and very, very, I think, well intended. The heart is in the right place, but I don't think we are implementing enough or near fast enough, or looking at specific projects which may have far-reaching impact. Therefore, I think on behalf of CARI, I thank you everyone for your contribution. And I say CARI is also working in this field. If there's anything we can do together, let's carry on with the conversation and move on ahead. So on that note, thank you again, everyone. And I'll pass the matters back to Juki.
Yes, thank you very much, Tan Sri. And of course, our thanks to all the panelists for sharing your thoughts with us for the past 2 hours. And of course, not mentioning that our keynote speaker has stayed on for the full 2 hours and listening to our conversation as well. And he's still with us. Unless you have a few points to share with us, we would be grateful. Your Excellency, if there is anything that you would like to share, we'd be grateful. But otherwise, yes.
It's a very, very fruitful discussion just now, and I agree with the panel just now. When you talk about recovery here, especially ASEAN recovery, I think we need to see it differently. Start somewhere fresh, somewhere new. So what we do is that when you talk about recovery, the green recovery is important. So it's in line with what we are talking about, the economic priority deliverables for ASEAN this year. So hopefully, as mentioned by Tan Sri Munir, there's something happening. There must be something happening at the ground level. So it's important for us to not only at the policymakers, but also at the implementers level, the private sectors, do implement this and take part in this, and then make things happen at the ground level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honorable Deputy Minister, for sharing with us so candidly. And we do hope that ASEAN will recover safer, better, and greener. And with that, we thank you all for joining us for the past 2 hours, and please support our future work, and we hope to see you again. In the meantime, stay safe and see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.